Okay, we'll move into our second part. I think, if I remember rightly, when I made this handout, the picture on the first page is actually an artistic rendering of the Egeria whose diary is talked about. I think that is the oldest image that we have of her. Now, whether it was actually painted to look like her or it comes after her life, I'm less certain. But I think that was her. As we talk about Jerusalem, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that it had been more or less destroyed by the Romans. After 135, there's a second Jewish revolt. So the temple is destroyed in 70 AD, and then there's another Jewish guy, I think the 135 one, I forget if it's Bar Kokhba or Judah HaNazi. It's one of the two, I'm pretty sure. There's a second Jewish revolt, and the Romans at that point are sort of like, okay, we've had it. Enough with this Jewish problem. So even though the city was already somewhat destroyed and the wall was destroyed, then they really go after it. And they erase it from the map and build the Temple of Jupiter on top of the Temple Mount and rename it Aelia Capitolina. But the Christians that were in the area seem to have survived with less issue. By that time, Christianity and Judaism had gone on divergent paths. So the Christian community in the area was relatively faithful. It could be kind of small, but they were not as persecuted by the Romans. It starts to change in the time of Constantine. One of the things that's difficult about Constantine is he's such a blended figure. I mean, in some ways he's an absolute ruler. In some way he's kind of vicious and he can be barbaric. And yet he seems to, a bit like Augustus, Octavian, he seems to see himself and have this sense of his place in history. That he is one of these hinge points around which history turns. And so he still does some bad things like a lot of us do, but he starts putting in some significant dollars and political energy into building much more of a Christian empire. And a lot of that takes place in Jerusalem. Whether it was because of his mother, St. Helen, or because of his internal thing, he spends a lot of money on Jerusalem and he starts building churches and monasteries. By this time, you'll find out later in the book as you continue to read, there's a church in a land called Armenia, which is over between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in southern Russia. And Armenia, for some reason, their monks, they develop this connection to the monasteries that are east of Jerusalem in the desert. If you've ever been to Israel, not all of the time will Catholic groups stop there, but there's actually several huge monasteries in the desert east of Jerusalem. So between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, which isn't very far. Jerusalem is, I think it's 10, 15 miles, maybe 20 miles to the Dead Sea. It's not real far. It's kind of, you go out east of the city and then you start going downhill. And at the very bottom of the hill is the Dead Sea in the valley. But there's some important monasteries out there. One of them is named Mar Saba. If you look online, you'll find that becomes a very important monastery. Several very famous monks, including, I think St. John of Damascus spent some time at Mar Saba, and it becomes important for a number of different things. And when I say monasteries, like some of them I think at their height had several thousand monks. Like, they weren't small places, they were huge. And they were more like cities in the desert. Jerusalem is the only major city in the world at this time that maintains the connection to the physical presence of Jesus. Even today, like Capernaum and the stuff up in Galilee isn't very developed. There aren't a lot of people that live there. I mean, they're much more developed than they were in the time of Jesus, but they're not enormous. Like Nazareth is one of the bigger ones, and I think that has about 40,000 people that live there. So Constantine starts building churches. I think it's either later in this one. We talk about the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre. So they start constructing these different basilicas and churches. Basilica, remember, is that Roman style. It means a building with 3 aisles and 2 sets of columns. Usually the middle is higher than the sides, and there's a set of windows along the top of the middle. And then it ends in this area where there's like 3 concave looking kind of clamshell things. Churches in Rome are built like this. Lots of churches are built like this, like St. Mary's has kind of the end of the apse, it's called, where it's kind of rounded. The New Holy Cross does. Traditional Roman basilicas have 3 of those, usually 1 bigger one in the center and 2 smaller ones on the sides. So what happens is Jerusalem becomes a place of pilgrimage. Christians start traveling to visit these places where Jesus lived. Now at the very beginning, remember, it's lots of rubble. It's hard to tell how much of the city survived this Roman stuff. You know, did they mostly destroy the Temple Mount? Did they destroy the whole thing? Part of me is inclined to believe that they couldn't have destroyed the whole thing because where would you go on pilgrimage to? You know, if it was just like a wheat field, you know, you walked through there like, this is where Jesus lived. Like, oh, there's lots of dirt. Very nice. So I suspect it was more than that, but it's hard to know what that was. I think it's good to reflect a little bit too on the nature of a pilgrimage, because some of you, maybe even many of you, have had the chance to go on a pilgrimage in your lifetime. If you haven't, it's something I would certainly recommend. Pilgrimages are notorious. If you do go on one, you should plan for something to go sideways. It almost always happens that something goes sideways somewhere. But a pilgrimage is meant to be, like in the modern world, we can get in a little bit of trouble because you can go and you can take lots of pictures and you want to capture all these pictures. And pictures can be helpful, they're not all bad. But the idea of a pilgrimage is that you're going to encounter God, that it's a spiritual journey as much as a physical one. So it's not to, sail on a boat over to Rome and eat filet mignon and all of these fancy things every day and, buy the golden rosary from the gift shop at the top of St. Peter's, and that's a pilgrimage. You should pray. You should, like Christians when they went to the Holy Land would read through the stories of the Gospels in the places where they likely took place. There's several of them. Sometimes it's hard, especially in the Holy Land, because things are so commercialized and it's developed. Like lots of the things that Jesus saw aren't there anymore. You get a little bit more of the sense of it up near the Sea of Galilee, where the sea is still in the same place and the landscape around there isn't as developed. But sometimes it's like, yeah, they built churches everywhere and whatever was there before they knocked down. Like, oh, this is where Jesus was. Bulldoze it, build a church. Like, it would have been nice to see. So the idea of a pilgrimage is being more than a tourist. And like I said, when you go on pilgrimage, you should just expect that there's something. It tends to be a good spiritual lesson that you need to learn. Not always one you want to learn, but something that you need to learn. And that's part of the beauty of pilgrimage. And so, like, as history develops, you should know that there aren't as many pilgrimage sites in the Western Roman Empire. The major ones become the city of Rome, where the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul are, and through a rather torturous history, Santiago de Compostela, where the remains of St. James end up on the western side of northern Spain. And then in England, St. Augustine of Canterbury, and who's the other saint in Canterbury? Who's the guy that was murdered by order of the king? And then no, not Thomas More. Thomas Becket. Is it Thomas Becket? Thomas More is later. He's in the time of King Henry VIII, also killed by the king, but there's an earlier one. And so in England, the pilgrims would often make a pilgrimage to one of two places. There's a place called Our Lady of Walsingham, and then to Canterbury Cathedral. But Christians start to come to Jerusalem, and Constantine seems to want Jerusalem to be a holy place. Like, this is where you start getting into his blended figure. You know, I don't quite understand how you can be kind of a warlord and fight these battles and have these people killed and still want to build a Christian Jerusalem, but he does. And so he's like, well, we're going to start building churches everywhere. Somehow I think this is the influence of his mother, who seems to have become very fond of Jerusalem. But regardless, he actually does it. Constantine was not always consistent in his practice of the faith. Remember, he delays baptism to right before he dies. But he does set aside significant money. He sends his mother with a couple legions of soldiers because she is inspired to go find the true cross of Jesus. They dig down into the rubble because that part was at least in the place that was destroyed, and they find 3 crosses. The place where they found them is now, like in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's kind of a main area, and then you go down a set of stairs into what's called the Armenian Chapel, and then you go down another set of stairs, and that's way back there, down the 3rd set of stairs, is where they found the true cross. So she actually finds it based on the stories of the local Christians. This is another important thing for history. Lots of modern scholarship is like, oh, the Bible doesn't know anything. That was written by all these faithful people. It's not true. It's not real. We can't trust it. And very often when people are like, well, the Bible says it was here. Let's actually look there. What do you know? There it is. That's happened a lot. One of the most famous stories is of the scholar that found ancient Troy. You know, scholarship and universities had decided it was just this mythical land and it didn't exist, and they had taught that for hundreds of years. And finally a guy, I forget if it was Homer's epics or something, but he went to where they said the city was, and he started digging, and he found it. Sometimes I try to tell kids, you know, if your parents ask you what you're doing and you actually tell them the truth and just give them the plain answer, kind of with a straight face, most of the time they say, oh, okay, and move on. What makes you suspicious as a parent is when you ask them what they're doing and they say nothing, and you're like, you know, if they actually just told you what it was, it probably wouldn't even register in your mind. Sometimes believing what people say is helpful. And in this case, it was, because she went where the local Christians said that this area where Jesus died was, and found it, to the great surprise of many. And there is a transition here. Oh, do you have a question, Barb?
They decided which cross belonged to Jesus.
So that part is a little bit funny because they dug down and they found 3 crosses. And, you know, so that is in accord with the gospel story. And they're trying to figure out which one was the cross of Jesus. And please don't say the one in the middle, because when something's been buried for several hundred years, expecting it to be in the same place that it was is foolish. But they take one of the crosses and they bring some people, I forget, I think one person had like a limb that was deformed and their limb regrows. And there's like 3 or 4 different miracles that happen with one of the crosses. So they decide that one's the true cross, and it enters Christian history as the true cross of Jesus. And it's because of the miracles that were done for the sick who it was touched to.
I have a question too. Is it such that the skull of Adam was found there too?
So the skull of Adam, that part I don't know. There becomes a tradition in history that the cross, the place of crucifixion, was over the burial place of Adam, like first guy in the Bible, Adam, Genesis, Adam. I think it makes a nice intellectual picture. I don't know. That to me seems to stretch it a little bit, because the story of Adam in the Bible is part of the time before history. It's prehistoric. In the Bible, the historic timeline, what is written down, starts after the life of Noah and after the flood. So how you calculate years before the flood is a challenge. But it's possible. I mean, I certainly wouldn't say it's impossible. Some of the great saints have talked about that, but part of me, it's really, really rare to find human remains that are that old. Like fossils, people get confused, but a fossil is actually a rock. Fossil is actually a rock. When they dig up dinosaur bones, they're not dinosaur bones. What happens is the bone was there and forms a cavity in the rock that over the centuries, as liquid goes into that area, it settles and the minerals leach out. So it keeps the shape, but it's not actually the bone. Petrified wood is a rock. It's not an ancient tree. I remember watching a video and it was like, oh yeah, that is important to remember. Because, Jurassic Park and getting DNA from dinosaur bones and all of that doesn't really work, because it's not actually a dinosaur bone, it's a rock. It keeps its shape, but it's different. It's like as the organic matter decays, it gets infilled and mineralized. You can read about fossilization, but I would expect something like the skull of Adam to be in the same category if they did find it. I could be wrong. I mean, I don't know how long human bones actually last, but it's, I would say it's unlikely. And people could say it's very likely, and that's fine. I mean, I would certainly propose to you that it's not dogmatic faith. That the hill of Calvary was the hill where Adam died. No, not part of Revelation. Not essential to believe. So they do have this new idea, though. Like in Christianity, at first there were holy people. Now there becomes a greater sense of holy places where holy people lived. That grace, becomes sort of like sticky and sticks to the place. And there's a kind of truth to this. It's really, really amazing to go to a monastery, for instance, where monks have been praying for 1,000 years. And people often just talk about the sense of peace, the sense of calm that they feel almost walking into the building. There's a reality to the holiness of places that is important. Now, certainly places aren't foundational to faith. Again, we work to preserve Christian places, but if a church burns down, we rebuild it. Like that kind of thing. It's not, place isn't so essential, but it can be used by the Lord. It can be important. And so places where Jesus lived, the place where Jesus died, becomes one of these holy places. And it's a little bit of history that they just had a different feel about than we do. So in the case of the place where the true cross was found, and then they found the hill of Calvary and the tomb of Jesus, they're very close together on the modern scale. What they do is they take the entire hill of Golgotha and chop it. They cut it off to build a flat area where they're going to build this big basilica. And they leave a little hump over where the cross was. They find the places in the rock where there were the holes where the crosses were. But they chop the whole hill off, they level it, and they build a church. And they cut out the whole tomb that Jesus died in. They cut out the whole thing except for the spot where he died. And they turn that kind of into an altar. And then the rest of it gets flattened. So it doesn't look like it did then. That's one of the things that for our modern sensibilities is a bit different. As one of my friends pointed out, in the Middle Ages, whenever something happened, they knocked it all down and built a church over the top of it because they wanted a church far more than they wanted the thing. We are much more conscious of actually preserving the space where something happened. Just a different feel. But they wanted a place to worship, a place to celebrate the Holy Mass. We have a very ancient account of Jerusalem from this diary of Egeria. So late 4th century, late 300s. Remember how numbers always work backwards in that kind of thing? Like the 1st century starts in the year 0 and not in the year 100. It's like they don't like us in English and they do all kinds of things to complicate it. So she's late 4th century. She comes on pilgrimage from the west. I forget, I'm not sure if her group comes out of Egypt or they come out of somewhere in Europe. I think she might be Europe. But she writes an account of her journey. And this is relatively unique because in the ancient world, we don't have as many actual writings of women. Women tended not to be as highly educated as men. They tended not to be as good at writing. Just culturally, there was more bias against that. But she does. It's very much her journal. And she's there during Holy Week. So she actually describes the ceremonies and the celebrations that are part of Holy Week in ancient Israel. And that's kind of a neat thing. I mean, that's kind of something special that is fun to return to. She talks about gathering at the Mount of Olives on Holy Thursday and doing prayers in the Basilica. On Good Friday, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane again, and then to a chapel of the Holy Cross. They had built by that point a chapel where they kept the relic of the true cross. And then they go to the tomb of Jesus, which was in this basilica that Constantine built. And they pray there at the tomb, and they read the Passion narrative. So you can feel some of this, like they read the Passion narrative that would have been in Greek. Some of the prayers likely were in Hebrew and in other languages. And so it's really neat. If you want to read an account of the ancient tradition of Holy Week and what the Christians did in Jerusalem, you can find it in this diary of Egeria. The Christians would travel to the places where the events took place, and they would often go on these processions. I kind of wonder what they're like because processions are always kind of disorganized. It's one of those ideas that sounds really, really great when you want to start it, and unless you have military drill sergeants who crack whips and sort of beat people into submission, it's a lot harder than you'd think to keep a group of people moving together in the same direction at the same time. they would go across the Jordan River. She notes that they go across the Jordan River to read part of Deuteronomy, where it was written on the east side and not in the Holy Land. And you can tell that this group, you can feel the development of some of the Holy Scriptures. They must have a somewhat complete Bible, or they at least have several scrolls or several collections of different books, because she talks about reading through like a gospel narrative that presupposes if you read through a gospel narrative, you have a gospel to read from, which means that it was copied, which means that they had decided that this was canonical scripture by this point already. And that's significant because you'll hear Protestants who will make kind of funky arguments sometimes about how stuff was invented in the 3rd century. And you can look at real authors from the 3rd century, and it's like she's talking about something that has already existed for a long time, that has become standard in Christianity. And so if it's already standard at the end of the 3rd century, that means some of this work has been done. Some of these things have already taken place. Because it takes time. I mean, there's no Twitter. There's no like, oh, it happened in ancient Jerusalem and you write about it today and the people read about it in France. Like, no, it took months to get there. And then they go around for several months in this kind of pilgrimage. And then they go back. And that takes another set of months. So this is probably a journey of the better part of a year, if not longer, where she goes on pilgrimage. One of the things that this kind of speaks to as well, and Catholicism has this kind of sense about it, that things that we can touch, things that we can see, things that we can feel, they're an important part of faith. Protestantism gets a little bit ethereal, like you have this spiritual relationship with Jesus. And that certainly isn't a bad thing, but think about a lot of Protestant churches. If you grew up in a Catholic church, or you see churches like the basilicas in Rome, you see churches like St. Anne and Joachim, and then you go into sort of a typical Lutheran church, and you almost always walk away saying, it was really plain. There wasn't a lot to look at. Sometimes there's a cross, sometimes there's a few pieces of art, but it's a much more spiritualized sense of faith. And there's goodness to that. Catholicism is much more along the lines of see it, touch it, taste it, feel it, that those things are important. You venerate the relics of saints. They're things that you can see. We have icons, we have statues, we have stained glass windows. Like all of these different pieces help speak to our physical nature as people, help speak to us as body and soul composite. Sometimes the way that I like to frame it is Catholicism hopes you get distracted in the right direction. You know, you could get distracted by lots of things, so we try to build beautiful churches with pieces of art and things to look at and those kind of things, because the idea is that they capture your heart and your mind and they help communicate spiritual truth, that it's not all just in your head. And I think Protestantism, in a lot of cases, is kind of recovering this. There's a lot less fear of some of these things that looked Catholic than there was at a certain point. So in Jerusalem and the Holy Land, this is a different time. The population is increasing because it comes under the dominion and authority of Rome, and the Jewish revolts are basically wiped out. What it ends up being is a time of prosperity, like it's repopulated. And in this case, sadly, somewhat sadly, it's mostly repopulated by Christians. The Holy Land becomes a very, very Christian place. The Jewish communities were exiled by the Romans. So in Alexandria, in the city of Rome, in other places in the empire, many of them moved north into Eastern Europe eventually. Some of them settle in enclaves in different parts of the world. But there's a long time, where there really aren't very many Jewish people in the Holy Land. So Jerusalem becomes a Christian city. Much of this new Christian city is built outside of the walls of Old Jerusalem. And this is one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you go to Jerusalem now, because you'll find even on the map there's an old city of Jerusalem, right? You've seen the old city of Jerusalem. And the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre is basically in the middle of the old city of Jerusalem. In the time of Jesus, that basilica would be outside the walls of the city. Like the city at the time of Jesus is about half of the size of the old city now. The old city wall was built in the Ottoman Empire. So much, much later. I think it dates from the 1500s. So compared to other things, it's actually not all that old. Very little in the Holy Land actually stretches back building-wise to the time of Jesus, because it was knocked down and fought over so many times. The oldest still standing church is the Church of St. Anne near the temple, and that was built by the Crusaders in the 1100s. But at this time, Christianity is sort of ascendant in the area of the Holy Land, and the Christians really go at it. So they build something like 500 churches, which is a lot. It's not a very big place for 500 churches. The Jewish people move north into Galilee near Caesarea and Tiberias. They move toward the sea. Jamnia, ancient Jamnia, is modern-day Yaffo near Tel Aviv. So if you go on pilgrimage, very often you go to a church of St. Peter, which is in Yaffo, and that commemorates the conversion of St. Cornelius in the book of Acts. That's where it happened, near this ancient city of Jamnia. And because language is weird, it's become the modern-day Yaffo. This is when the Jewish people write the Talmud. The Talmud is a giant book. It's a series of books now, usually. I think it runs to 15 or 18 volumes. And it's a very, very complex book. It's a writing of the Jewish oral history and the teaching of the rabbis. Parts of it are very, very old. And there's two different Talmuds. There's a Jerusalem Talmud from the rabbis in the Holy Land, and then there's a Babylonian Talmud. And the standard Talmud of the modern era has become this Babylonian text. But the Jerusalem one, the one from the Holy Land, was probably written in an area like Jamnia. So, post-Constantine. Constantine eventually dies. I know you're surprised by that, but just in case, everyone dies eventually, even if you want to live forever. And he divides the empire among his 3 sons. Guess how well this is going to work?